This documentary is presented for educational purposes only. Every fact, event, and interpretation is based on verified historical records, academic research, and the works of leading economists and historians. This is not financial or political advice. It's history, told through evidence. Have you ever wondered how one of the greatest economic storms in human history began, transforming an era of dazzling prosperity into years of uncertainty and struggle? Welcome to Lost Thrones, where history isn't just remembered, it's experienced, where every decision and turning point reveals the hidden forces that shaped our world. Today, we journey deep into the Great Depression, a time that tested human endurance, reshaped nations, and forever changed how we understand the economy. You'll witness the roaring optimism of the 1920s, the crash that shook the global system, and the long road to recovery that followed. If you believe history still speaks to us, teaching, warning, and inspiring, then join us on this journey. Hit the like button to support educational storytelling and subscribe to Lost Thrones for more documentaries that uncover the truths buried beneath time. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. The Roaring Twenties. Imagine America in the 1920s. Jazz echoed through the streets. Skyscrapers pierced the clouds, and the spirit of progress seemed unstoppable. The world would later remember this as the Roaring Twenties, an age of optimism, invention, and dazzling growth. The decade after World War I brought unprecedented economic expansion to the United States. Factories roared with new energy, automobiles rolled off assembly lines by the millions, and radios connected homes across the nation. For the first time, modern convenience became part of everyday life. The stock market turned ordinary citizens into eager investors. Credit was easy to obtain. Families bought homes, cars, and appliances they once could only dream of. Prosperity felt endless. The numbers tell the story. Stock prices surged nearly 300% between 1924 and 1929. Unemployment stayed below 4% throughout most of the decade. Manufacturing output doubled, and real wages rose across industries. Newspapers celebrated progress. Politicians promised endless growth. The future felt bright, almost invincible. But beneath that golden surface, the first cracks had already begun to form. Early warning signs. What few noticed at the time were signs of imbalance quietly building in the shadows. In agriculture, farm prices had fallen since 1920. Rural debt was rising, and small farmers struggled to survive in a world that had moved on from wartime demand. In finance, stock speculation grew wild. Investors bought shares on margin, borrowing money to gamble on rising prices. Warnings of overvaluation were drowned out by the thrill of easy wealth. In society, wealth became increasingly concentrated at the top, while millions of working families found their wages lagging behind. The benefits of this boom weren't reaching everyone. Even within the Federal Reserve, debates grew tense. How could they balance soaring growth with stability? No one wanted to slow the boom. No one believed it could end. And so, the nation danced deeper into a decade of dazzling lights, unaware that a shadow was quietly forming behind the music. The stage was set for a storm no one saw coming. Chapter 2. Economic Policy in the Late 1920s. As the 20s raced toward their glittering end, a quiet tension grew behind the scenes. The U.S. economy was booming, but so was the speculation. In the middle of it all stood a young institution, still learning how to steer a growing nation's financial pulse, the Federal Reserve. Created in 1913, the Fed was barely a decade old. Its mission, to balance growth with stability. But its leaders faced a challenge they had never encountered before: how to control prosperity that seemed unstoppable. The Federal Reserve's dilemma. In 1927, the Federal Reserve lowered interest rates to support struggling European economies still recovering from World War I. Cheaper credit flowed back into the American system. Loans were easy, money was plentiful, and Wall Street's fever only intensified. By 1928, alarm bells began to ring. The stock market had become a playground for speculation, with investors borrowing huge sums to chase rising prices. Determined to cool things down, the Fed reversed course, raising rates in an attempt to slow the frenzy. Later research would reveal these sharp shifts in monetary policy became a key factor in what was about to unfold. But at the time, the data was limited. Economic theory was still evolving. No one truly knew what would happen next. A fragile banking system. Beneath the surface of prosperity lay another problem: America's banking structure. Over 25,000 banks operated independently, scattered across towns and cities with little coordination. There was no federal insurance for deposits. When one bank failed, panic could spread quickly from community to community. Even small shocks could ripple outward, creating regional crises that no one could contain. The global connection. Meanwhile, the rest of the world was struggling to stay balanced. Europe's economies were still recovering from war debts. The gold standard tied currencies together, limiting governments' ability to respond to downturns. International trade, loans, and repayments formed a web so tight that a tremor in one country could echo across oceans. The world had become trapped by its own financial system. Everyone depended on stability, but no one could control it. By decade's end, America stood at a crossroads. The numbers looked strong. Confidence was high. But deep beneath the charts and headlines, hidden weaknesses were waiting. The economy had become a towering structure built on fragile foundations. And soon, all it would take was a single shock to bring it crashing down. Chapter 3. October 1929. The market crash. It began with whispers on Wall Street, uneasy glances, nervous smiles. Then, in a single week, optimism turned to panic, and history changed forever. The week that changed history. October 24th, 1929. Black Thursday. The morning bell rang and stock prices began to fall like dominoes. Within hours, the trading floor was chaos. 12.9 million shares exchanged hands, a record the world had never seen. Bankers rushed to intervene, pooling money to buy major stocks and restore calm. By afternoon, the market briefly steadied, but the damage was done. Confidence had cracked. October 28th, Black Monday. The Dow Jones Industrial Average plunged 13% in a single day. Phones rang endlessly, brokers screamed orders, and panic rippled through the nation. The systems built to handle the frenzy simply couldn't keep up. October 29th, Black Tuesday. The collapse reached its breaking point. 16.4 million shares traded. The Dow fell another 12%. Nearly $14 billion in market value vanished in 1929 dollars. The dream was over. what really happened. The crash wasn't caused by one event. It was the final spark in a field already soaked with gasoline. The triggers were clear. Investor confidence shattered. Margin calls forced people to sell. Panic spread faster than logic, and buyers disappeared. Behind the panic were deeper problems: overvalued stocks, high debt, and virtually no market regulation. When fear took hold, the entire system unraveled. Human impact. For millions of Americans, the crash wasn't just numbers on a ticker, it was everything. Families gathered around their radios, listening in disbelief as announcers described the chaos. Savings were wiped out overnight. Dreams of security and success dissolved into uncertainty. Stories from the era tell of investors staring silently at the headlines, of business owners locking their doors, of ordinary citizens wondering what tomorrow would bring. The aftermath. In the days and weeks that followed, the nation held its breath. President Herbert Hoover urged calm. Bankers and industrialists assured the public it was only a correction, a temporary dip. But this was no brief downturn. The decline deepened month after month. Factories slowed, banks began to fail, and across America, the lights of prosperity started to fade. More than just a crash. October 1929 was not the cause of the Great Depression, but the catalyst. The cracks that had been forming for years finally split open. The system that once seemed invincible revealed its flaws. The stock market crash didn't just end a decade, it began an era defined by hardship, reform, and a desperate search for answers. The nation was about to face a trial that would test every institution, every leader, and every citizen. Chapter 4. The Federal Reserve's Response. When the markets fell, the world turned to one institution for stability, guidance, and hope: the Federal Reserve. But what followed revealed the limits of knowledge, the weight of uncertainty, and the complexity of a system still in its infancy. The crash of 1929 wasn't just a financial collapse, it was a test of economic understanding itself. The challenge of crisis management. The Federal Reserve had been created only 16 years earlier. It was still a young institution, built for an era of industrial optimism, not for the chaos of a collapsing global economy. The Fed faced a challenge it was unprepared to handle: how to fight a crisis the world had never seen before. The Fed's actions, 1929 to 1933. In the early months after the crash, the Fed did act, but cautiously. It provided some liquidity to banks, reduced interest rates gradually, and carried out open market operations. Yet its power was constrained. The gold standard tied America's hands, limiting how much money could circulate. Leaders feared inflation, still haunted by memories of World War I. And within the Federal Reserve itself, power was decentralized, divided among regional banks that often disagreed on what to do. The result was hesitation, when the moment demanded boldness. The banking crisis. Then came the bank failures. They began quietly, then multiplied like falling dominoes. 1930, 1,352 banks failed. 1931, 2,294 banks failed. 1932, 1,456 banks failed. 1933, over 4,000 banks collapsed before reforms. Depositors lined up outside banks at dawn, desperate to withdraw their savings before the doors closed for good. Loans went unpaid. Businesses shuttered. Confidence the invisible force that keeps any economy alive, evaporated. There was no federal deposit insurance, no safety net. When a bank failed, the ordinary people lost everything. Economic collapse. By 1933, the numbers told a grim story. The nation's GDP had fallen by nearly 30%. Unemployment soared from 3% to 25%. Prices plummeted, a brutal deflation that crushed wages and profits alike. International trade collapsed by nearly 65%. The American economy, once the engine of global growth, had ground to a halt. Lessons in hindsight. Decades later, economists would look back and ask, could the Fed have done more? In their groundbreaking study, A Monetary History of the United States, Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz argued that a more aggressive expansion of the money supply might have softened the blow. The tools existed, but fear, division, and uncertainty kept them unused. Other scholars point out that the gold standard and the political atmosphere made bold action nearly impossible. No one wanted to risk inflation, and few truly understood deflation's deadly spiral. This wasn't just a financial crisis, it was a failure of imagination. The global dimension. Meanwhile, the rest of the world was unraveling. Britain abandoned the gold standard in 1931, triggering panic across Europe. Banks in Austria and Germany collapsed. Trade barriers rose, cutting off vital commerce. What began in New York had now engulfed the planet. As Barry Eichengreen would later write in Golden Fetters, the gold standard acted like a chain linking nations to the same sinking ship. Each country tried to save itself, but all went down together. In those desperate years, the Federal Reserve learned a lesson that would shape every future crisis. Inaction can be as dangerous as the wrong action. The world would never again see central banking the same way. And as the American people searched for answers, a new leader would soon emerge. One who promised a bold and unprecedented response. Chapter 5. The New Deal. When Franklin D. Roosevelt took the oath of office in March 1933, America stood on the edge of despair. Banks were collapsing, unemployment was everywhere, and faith in the system was gone. In his calm yet determined voice, Roosevelt promised a new deal for the American people. It wasn't just a policy, it was hope reborn. And it would change the relationship between the government and its people forever. The banking crisis response. The first battle was against fear itself. Within hours of becoming president, Roosevelt declared a bank holiday. Every bank in the nation closed, not to end panic, but to restore confidence. Federal inspectors reviewed each institution. Only the sound and stable ones were allowed to reopen. Then came the Emergency Banking Act, passed within days. It gave the government authority to stabilize banks and reassure the public. When the banks reopened, people brought their money back. The tide had turned. And soon after came one of the most important reforms in U.S. history, the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933. It created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, guaranteeing deposits up to $2,500. For the first time, Americans could trust that their savings were safe. After 1933, bank failures almost vanished. The New Deal in action. Once the banks were stable, the fight turned to the streets, to hunger, joblessness, and despair. Roosevelt's administration launched a wave of programs designed not just to restore the economy, but to rebuild lives. The Civilian Conservation Corps put young men to work planting trees, building national parks, and restoring lands. They sent money home to their families, breathing life into communities once abandoned. The Works Progress Administration created more than 8 million jobs from 1935 to 1943. They built schools, bridges, roads, airports, and even supported artists, writers, and musicians. The very culture of America was lifted from its own ruins. The Public Works Administration funded dams, hospitals, and public buildings, the bones of a modern nation rising from the dust. Supporting farmers and workers. The countryside had suffered as deeply as the cities. Farm prices had collapsed, leaving millions in ruin. Through the Agricultural Adjustment Act, farmers were paid to reduce production, a radical idea to balance supply and demand. It helped stabilize prices and restore dignity to the rural economy. At the same time, labor found a new voice. The National Labor Relations Act of 1935 guaranteed the right to organize and bargain collectively. For the first time, workers stood on equal footing with their employers. And then came a promise that endures to this day: the Social Security Act of 1935. It introduced pensions for the elderly, unemployment insurance, and aid for the disabled and dependent children. It was the birth of the American social safety net. Regulating the financial system, the New Deal also changed Wall Street forever. The Securities and Exchange Commission, created in 1934, brought accountability to the markets. Corporations were now required to disclose their finances, protecting investors from the speculative frenzy that once caused ruin. For the first time, the invisible world of finance had rules and a referee. The results and the debate. Between 1933 and 1937, the American economy began to breathe again. Unemployment fell from 25% to 14%. GDP surged. Confidence returned. But the path wasn't smooth. In 1937, the economy slipped back into recession, a reminder that recovery was fragile. Even so, the foundation had changed forever. Debate continues about the New Deal's effectiveness. Supporters say it saved democracy at a moment of despair, creating jobs, stability, and faith in the system. Critics argue that some programs were inefficient, that recovery came slowly, and that World War II ultimately ended the Depression. Yet both sides agree on one truth: the New Deal redefined the American government. The legacy. The institutions born in that era still shape the nation today. The FDIC, protecting every depositor's trust. The SEC, guarding market transparency. The Social Security system, supporting millions of families. Labor rights that remain fundamental to working life. Whatever its flaws, the New Deal permanently changed the contract between the people and their government. It proved that in moments of despair, bold leadership could rebuild a broken world. A new America had begun to rise, one that believed the future could still be built, even from the wreckage of its past. And soon, the shock waves of recovery would ripple far beyond its borders, shaping not just one nation, but the entire world. Chapter 6: Global Impact. The Great Depression was not just an American tragedy, it was a global storm. From the factories of Europe to the rice field of Asia, from the coffee plantations of Brazil to the markets of London, no nation escaped its reach. What began as a financial crisis soon became a crisis of civilization itself. Europe, the shattered continent. In Europe, the echoes of the 1929 crash struck lands already weakened by the scars of World War I. Debt, reparations, and fragile economies made the continent a tinderbox waiting for a spark. Germany, a nation on the brink. Germany suffered more than most, still burdened by war reparations and haunted by the hyperinflation of the 1920s. The Depression hit like a hammer. Factories closed, banks failed. By 1932, unemployment had reached 30%. Industrial output had fallen by 40%. Economic chaos spilled into politics. Desperation gave rise to extremism. This economic collapse became one of the forces that reshaped Germany's destiny in the 1930s. Britain, the fall of an empire's confidence. Britain, the old global power, faced its own reckoning. By 1931, it abandoned the gold standard, breaking a financial tradition that had defined the empire for decades. Unemployment rose above 20%, especially in industrial regions of the north. In response, Britain turned inward, tightening its Commonwealth trade, protecting its own markets. The empire survived, but the illusion of invincibility was gone. France, late to the fall, slow to recover. France entered the Depression later than its neighbors, but once the decline began, it lingered. Unemployment rose sharply, and political instability shook the republic. Governments fell one after another. Faith in democracy weakened. The crisis didn't just wound the economy, it fractured national unity. Asia and Latin America, the ripple across oceans. The Depression's shockwaves didn't stop in the West. They crossed oceans and altered entire continents. Japan, the rising sun in turmoil. Japan's booming export economy suddenly collapsed. Global demand for silk, cotton, and manufactured goods evaporated. Rural poverty deepened. And within that poverty, the military gained power, arguing that expansion abroad could solve economic misery at home. This moment marked a turning point, when Japan's ambitions turned outward, setting the stage for the conflicts of the 1930s and 1940s. China, a fragile nation, hit by crisis. China, already divided by internal struggles and regional warlords, faced a devastating decline in trade. Agricultural prices fell, and farmers were pushed to the edge of survival. The Depression deepened instability in a country already fighting to define its future. Latin America, the collapse of commodities. Across Latin America, coffee, sugar, copper, and rubber, the lifeblood of economies, lost their value overnight. Exports plummeted. Governments defaulted on debts. In response, a new movement emerged: economic nationalism. Nations began to turn inward, developing their own industries and rejecting foreign dependence. It was the beginning of import substitution, a model that would define Latin American economies for decades. The global trade collapse. World trade, the arteries of global prosperity, collapsed by 65% between 1929 and 1933. Protective tariffs rose. Nations fought to shield their industries. The Smoot-Hawley tariff in the United States raised import taxes on thousands of goods, triggering retaliation from other countries. These trade wars turned a deep recession into a global catastrophe. Instead of cooperation, the world chose isolation. The gold standard and the chains of recovery. The gold standard, meant to ensure stability, became a trap. Nations tied to gold couldn't expand their money supply, couldn't spend, couldn't breathe. As Barry Eichengreen revealed in Golden Fetters, countries that abandoned gold recovered faster, while those that clung to it, like a sinking ship, sank even deeper. Social and political consequences. The Depression was more than an economic event. It was a social earthquake. In many countries, democratic institutions faltered under the strain. Economic nationalism grew. Tensions between nations deepened. And in the shadows of hardship, the seeds of World War II began to take root. A crisis that changed the world. The Great Depression redrew the map of global power. It reshaped governments, toppled economies, and forever changed how nations viewed trade, money, and cooperation. It showed humanity one painful truth, that in an interconnected world, economic collapse anywhere could mean suffering everywhere. And as the 1930s unfolded, the world would begin to search for answers. What had gone wrong? And more importantly, how could it ever be prevented again? Those answers would come not just through pain and reform, but through a revolution in how humanity thought about economics itself. Chapter 7. Lessons for Modern Economics. The Great Depression did more than shatter economies. It transformed the way humanity understood money, policy, and power. Out of that darkness came new ideas, new institutions, and new wisdom, lessons that still shape the world we live in today. Lesson 1. Central banks must act. When the banking system fell apart in the 1930s, there was no blueprint for saving it. No one knew how far panic could spread or how fast it could destroy confidence. But those who lived through that chaos learned something vital. Central banks must act as the lender of last resort. They must move fast, provide liquidity, and never allow fear to freeze the flow of money. Years later, during the 2008 financial crisis, Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke, a scholar of the Great Depression, put those lessons into action. The Fed slashed interest rates, flooded the system with cash, and prevented a total collapse. That moment proved that the ghosts of 1929 still whisper to the modern world. Lesson 2. The power of deposit insurance. In the early 1930s, when banks failed, families lost everything overnight. No protection, no refunds, no second chances. The FDIC, created in 1933, changed that forever. For the first time, depositors knew their savings were safe, even if a bank collapsed. It restored trust. It stopped the panicked lines outside banks, and it became a model adopted by nations around the world. A simple idea, but one that turned fear into confidence and chaos into stability. Lesson 3. The world is interconnected. The Depression revealed a painful truth. No nation stands alone. Economic pain in one country can cross oceans in weeks. Trade collapses, currencies weaken, all economies fall together. This understanding led to something extraordinary after World War II. The creation of institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank in 1944, and decades later, the World Trade Organization. Their purpose was simple yet profound: to prevent another global economic meltdown through cooperation, not isolation. The Great Depression had shown what happens when nations turn inward. The post-war world vowed never to repeat that mistake. Lesson 4. The rise of automatic stabilizers. The Depression taught policymakers another lesson: that governments must protect citizens before collapse, not after. That's where automatic stabilizers came in. Unemployment insurance, Social Security, food assistance, and progressive taxation. These systems, born from 1930s pain, help cushion modern recessions. They keep families afloat. They prevent economic freefall. As modern economists say, safety nets don't just save people, they save economies. Lesson 5. The need for financial regulation. The Roaring 1920s had a dangerous secret. Markets ran wild, unregulated, driven by speculation and greed. The crash of 1929 exposed the cost of that freedom. In response, America created institutions that endure to this day. The Securities and Exchange Commission to police markets, and the Glass-Steagall Act to separate commercial and investment banking. Transparency, accountability, and protection. These became the new commandments of finance. The great theories, born from crisis. In the ashes of failure, two economic revolutions were born. John Maynard Keynes, the brilliant British economist, proposed a bold idea: that government spending during recessions could spark recovery. He called it stimulus, and his theory reshaped global policy. Later came Milton Friedman, whose work with Anna Schwartz redefined how we understand money itself. They argued that controlling the money supply, not just spending, was the key to stability. Together, these two schools, Keynesian economics and monetarism, became the twin pillars of modern economic thought. Today, most central banks use a synthesis of both, combining government action with monetary precision. The ongoing debate. Even now, economists still argue, what is the perfect balance between freedom and regulation, between markets and governments, between stability and innovation? There are no simple answers, only deeper questions. But one truth endures. The world that emerged from the Great Depression is wiser, more cautious, and forever aware that prosperity is fragile. The Depression didn't just change history, it changed how humanity thinks about the future. It turned suffering into knowledge, and knowledge into resilience. And that resilience still protects us today. Chapter 8. Recovery and Transformation. The Great Depression was not just a decade of despair, it was a test of endurance, a story of rebuilding, and a journey toward transformation. From the ruins of broken banks and silent factories, a new America began to rise, slowly, painfully, but with unshakable resolve. The long road back. Recovery came in stages, each marked by both hope and heartbreak. From 1933 to 1937, the nation began to heal. The economy grew at an average of 9% per year. Factories reopened. The hum of industry returned. Unemployment fell from 25% to 14%. The banking system stabilized. Confidence, once shattered, began to flicker back to life. But the road wasn't smooth. In 1937, another recession struck, a sharp reminder that recovery was fragile. Debate continues about its causes. Was it policy missteps, or simply the exhaustion of a weary economy? Whatever the reason, recovery resumed by 1939. And by 1941, the United States stood on the brink of a transformation that would change the world forever. War and the return of prosperity. When the engines of World War II began to roar, they pulled the American economy into overdrive. Factories that once stood silent now worked day and night. Men enlisted. Women entered the workforce. Full employment returned, not through peace, but through the demands of global conflict. Government spending soared. Industrial production exploded. And for the first time in over a decade, The Great Depression was truly over. While war is never a path to prosperity, the mobilization of industry during World War II completely transformed the U.S. economy, ushering in an era of power and productivity unlike anything before. Lasting changes to American society. The 1930s and 40s did more than heal the economy. They reshaped the very foundation of American life. Institutionally, government found a new role: to safeguard stability, to regulate markets, and to protect citizens from collapse. Economically, the nation diversified. Banks became stronger. Financial rules became stricter. And industries modernized under the pressure of necessity. Socially, something deeper changed. People began to expect a safety net, protection from forces beyond their control. Citizenship now meant not just rights, but resilience. A new relationship was born between people and their government, built on trust, caution, and collective security. Stories of resilience. Even in the darkest years, the human spirit refused to surrender. Families shared what little they had. Neighbors supported one another. Churches, charities, and communities kept hope alive. There were stories of kindness in every corner. A loaf of bread shared, a roof offered to a stranger, a hand extended in faith. And amid the hardship, innovation thrived. Inventors kept experimenting. Writers and artists told the stories of struggle and survival. The Works Progress Administration funded murals, bridges, schools, and songs that still echo today. From despair came creativity. From crisis came culture. And from that collective struggle came a generation defined by strength, humility, and endurance. A changed nation. By 1945, the United States was no longer the same country that had fallen into darkness in 1929. It had become a global leader, an industrial powerhouse with modern systems of finance and a renewed sense of purpose. It had built a social safety net, protected workers' rights, and embraced the idea that prosperity must be shared, not just earned. The people who lived through it became known as the Depression generation. They carried its lessons in their hearts. The value of hard work, the importance of saving, and the fear of ever letting it happen again. The Great Depression had ended, but its echoes would live on, in every law, every institution, and every policy designed to protect the future. This was more than recovery. It was a transformation, a rebirth of faith, a reimagining of the American dream. And from the ashes of economic ruin, a new world began to rise. The Great Depression, a decade that began with silence in the stock exchange and ended with the roar of war machines. It was not just an economic disaster, it was a mirror held up to humanity, showing what happens when ambition outruns wisdom and confidence turns into blindness. But it was also a story of redemption, of lessons learned and resilience rediscovered. What the Great Depression teaches us. From this long and haunting journey, 4 truths stand above the rest. First, economic systems are fragile. They are built on confidence, trust, and balance. When one falters, the rest can collapse like dominoes. The Depression proved that prosperity without regulation is a dream balanced on thin air. Second, preparation matters. Strong institutions, safety nets, and cooperation are not luxuries. They are lifelines. The nations that built them survived. Those that didn't suffered. Third, human resilience is extraordinary. Even when everything collapsed, when jobs vanished, when savings turned to dust, people adapted. They created, they helped, they endured. And fourth, every policy, every decision has consequences. The choices made in panic or pride can echo for generations. The Great Depression reminds us that leadership is not just power, it is responsibility. Modern relevance. Today, nearly a century later, economists still study the Great Depression not as a tale of the past, but as a warning for the future. When the 2008 financial crisis struck, the world remembered 1929. Governments acted faster, central banks worked together, and this time recovery came sooner because the lessons of history had finally been learned. The Depression had taught the world that silence in crisis is the most dangerous sound of all. Ongoing research and reflection. Around the world, universities still teach this era. Students still analyze the data, debate the theories, and compare it to every new crisis that emerges. The Great Depression became a compass for modern economic thought, a guide to what must never be repeated. Every decade brings new challenges, but the past continues to whisper, "Remember what we learned the hard way." Final thoughts. The Great Depression was a storm that tested humanity's endurance and a dawn that redefined its future. It taught us that stability must be guarded, cooperation must be cherished, and progress must be earned again and again. This is not just a story of loss, it's a story of learning, not just of collapse, but of rebuilding. And most importantly, it's a story of people, ordinary people, who refuse to give up. Thank you for joining us on this historical journey through one of humanity's greatest economic trials. Here on Lost Thrones, we believe that understanding our past is the key to navigating our future. If you have found this story enlightening, remember to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Because every discussion, every question helps us keep history alive. And as we move forward, may we never forget the timeless truth the Great Depression revealed, that even in the darkest hour, human resilience is the light that never fades. In the end, history is more than just a record of what happened. It is a reflection of who we are and who we can become. The story of the Great Depression reminds us that even when the world breaks, the human spirit finds a way to rebuild. It reminds us that wisdom is born from struggle, and that every crisis, no matter how great, carries the seeds of renewal. Here at Lost Thrones, we believe history is not just about kings, wars, or empires. It's about people, ordinary people, who shape the destiny of the world through courage, resilience, and hope. If this story moved you, if it made you think, reflect, or learn something new, then don't let it end here. Like this video to help it reach more curious minds. Subscribe to Lost Thrones to explore more untold stories from the pages of history. And share your thoughts in the comments below. Because history lives on when we talk about it, question it, and learn from it together. Thank you for watching. And remember, every throne that was lost, every empire that fell, left behind a story waiting to be found. This is Lost Thrones, where the echoes of the past find their voice once again.